I just can't tell you, when you invited me, and thank you, Lindsay, what's so exciting to speak here with all of you is that Fred Leadership represents so many of the values that I personally care about and that Acumen stands for. And this week, especially when we're watching this country pull itself apart, knowing that there's a group of people that are gathering to talk about what it means to lead is incredibly heartening, and we need to double down on having those conversations. So I just feel very honored that you would have me speak here. And Michelle asked if I would speak a little bit about my own personal leadership journey, and she kind of gave you the highlights, and maybe it will help if I go through a little bit of what I've learned along the way. As she said, I started my career on Wall Street during a time of financial crisis, early 1980s. And so Chase always seemed to have me down in Latin America to look at what was happening with hyperinflation in Brazil, Peru, Colombia. And I found that I loved the tools of banking. I loved seeing how numbers could tell a story, how investment could unleash energy. But what I didn't love was how the poor had no access to the banks, and in fact, hi Selena, wouldn't even walk into the doors of the banks. And so, because I was crazy, in 1986, I moved to Rwanda, a country I couldn't even find on a map at the time, and I ended up starting the country's first microfinance bank with a small group of women and learned a lot of lessons. But mostly saw both how it was possible to change a little corner of history if you dared to move outside the mold. And again, I saw how markets could be a powerful tool as a listening device to understand how the poor made decisions, but they were also very limited. And on the other hand, when it came to poverty, I'd seen top-down approaches to solving problems create dependency, massive inefficiencies, and too often really fetter people rather than release them. And that, if anything, we are defining poverty incorrectly. We see it in dollar terms rather than whether we have choice and opportunity or dignity. But at the end of Rwanda, I realized I wanted more tools, I wanted more skills, I wanted to build an institution that didn't depend on people just being entrepreneurs, but could actually provide them real jobs at scale. And so I went to Stanford Business School, and it was an interesting year, 1989, when I arrived. About a month later, the Berlin Wall fell down. And so suddenly, it was the end of history. Capitalism had won, communism had lost. We were going to be a global world. Globalization was just beginning. And yet, it was seriously the beginning of the technological revolution. Steve Jobs got on stage and talked about these personal computers. Only the rich kids really owned laptop computers, and they weighed about 15 to 20 pounds. The rest of us were down in the computer lab. Not a single one of us owned a cell phone. In our ethics class, we talked about our ethical and fiduciary responsibility to the shareholder above all else, and our hero was Milton Friedman. And you think about how the world has changed in 30 years since then. And many times I felt like a misfit because I went to business school so that I could learn the tools to go and make change. But luckily, when I was sitting in our second term, which was the first time we got to choose our courses, as professor after professor would come up, and they would talk about their classes in vector analysis and Black-Scholes theory and advanced financial mechanisms, and I was kind of waiting. This elderly man in a fedora and a houndstooth coat stood there and said, why do civilizations rise and fall? Why do some 30-year-olds get on the couch and never get off? And other people renew themselves with a childlike curiosity long into their 70s and their 80s and their 90s. I want to teach about self-renewal and institutional renewal. And I fell in love on the spot. I marched into his office, introduced myself, asked if he would be my mentor, and had no idea who he was. And he turned out to be a man named John Gardner. John Gardner was the only Republican on Lyndon B. Johnson's cabinet. in the 1960s. He was the head of HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, and he led the war on poverty, the Great Society, something we wouldn't imagine right now. And he was walking integrity. And at the core of what John would talk to me about was not only aphorisms like, it's more important to be interested than interesting, which sounds so distant in this winner-take-all moment, but he would push me to be committed to something bigger than myself and talk about the need for renewing institutions or they die. He had just seen the 1960s and saw too many institutions get stuck. And so I miss him. He's not been with us for about 15 years, but I talk to him almost every day. Those ideas of renewing, because we're in a moment now where our old institutions no longer work and we've yet to define the new ones. And that's why moral leadership is so important. Because Steve Jobs was right. That technological revolution came to bear. There are more cell phones in the planet today, 30 years, than there are people. We're connected to everyone, and yet at the same time we're more unequal, we're more divided, and we're certainly angrier than we've been ever in my lifetime. And so we need not just a technological revolution, we need a moral revolution. And that's really what I understand now, in some ways, what so many of you have been working on, and I've been working on parts of in my life. And so I want to go back and talk a little bit about Acumen. Because when we started Acumen in 2001, I'm not quite sure we understood what kind of tools we were building. I thought that we were certainly trying to change the way the world tackles poverty, but really looking at it from the philanthropy angle, that philanthropy was broken, that if we just kept giving money away, we weren't going to solve the tough problems of poverty, and so therefore we needed patient capital. What I've seen over time is that capitalism also needs a reboot. And so we're finding that so much of the work we do actually transcends, and that the bottom line is this revolution needs every single one of us, no matter where we work, in the corporate sector, in the private sector, or the government sector, in the nonprofit sector. But back in 2001, the way we conceived of patient capital was this. We would raise philanthropy, and then we would find entrepreneurs that were trying to solve some of the toughest problems that we face: healthcare, education, agriculture, energy. We would accompany them by investing equity or debt, primarily equity, for a 10 to 15 year period. We would give them access to markets, to other resources, importantly, and some of you work on this, talent. And then, if we got the money back, we would reinvest it because we stood for the public good in more innovation for the poor. And we would try best we could to measure what mattered, not only what we could count. Now, when I was first pitching this idea, despite the fact that I had an MBA and I had built a bank, I would be met by almost the same line every time on Wall Street. Jacqueline, sounds interesting, but you just don't understand business. Because business is about making as much money as you can make, and then I give my money over there to charity. And it took a long time. But one of the things that I've learned about leadership is that it doesn't happen without fellowship, it doesn't happen without partnership, it doesn't happen without followership. And so lucky there was a small group of truly enthusiastic seekers who came along for the ride. And as Michelle said, today we've, on the philanthropic side, invested over $100 million in about 100 companies. And we've seen those companies bring in $600 million directly as the companies have been able to attract more traditional types of capital and reach 270 million services. It's also allowed Acumen to go into the for-profit space. So now we're almost becoming a fund of funds where we've got philanthropic types of funds unapologetically, because now we understand, particularly in healthcare and education, that you need this mix ultimately of government in the private sector, but we can start with philanthropy in the private sector, to another 100 million on the for-profit side so that we can grow these companies. What I didn't understand when we started, however, was that a single company, if truly accompanied, could disrupt an entire industry, particularly in really broken ones. So a core tenet of our framework for moral leadership is to look at investment not as the end in itself, but as the means to solving a tough problem. One of our best examples is two guys out of business school approached us in 2007 with a $30 solar lantern and this dream to eradicate kerosene. At the time, 1.5 billion people in the world had no access to electricity. And so they'd be consigned to dirty, polluting, dangerous, expensive kerosene that worked for them because they could pay for it on a daily basis, 40 cents a day, tiny amounts. If they didn't have any cash in their pocket, they just went without light that night. But they hated it, but they were stuck with it. So we took a bet, $200,000, and for the first 3 or 4 years, I thought the company might go bankrupt. There was no trust, people had no financing mechanisms, it was a massive behavioral change for them, and they were sabotaged all the time by the kerosene mafias who had no interest in seeing a disruptor coming into the marketplace. But in 2011, you started to see things happening outside the solar industry, and that was mobile banking. Suddenly, particularly in Kenya, where 70% of the country now owns a smartphone, you can pay for your solar devices on a daily basis like you used to be able to pay for kerosene. And that's where you start to see this massive upswing in the demand curve. And now, D-Light, the single company, has brought light and increasingly electricity to 85 million people. And it's been an incredible ride for us because we've also learned. We've come to understand how low-income people make decisions about electricity. We've come to understand how 140 years after Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, how unjust and dangerous it is that 60% of Africa has no electricity, and that now we have a solution. And so that then allowed us to learn and start to invest across this emerging energy ecosystem. So we were investing not only in solar lighting, but in cook stoves and in mini grids and in microgrids and in financing mechanisms so that you could quickly build a sector. And then that, in this journey of leadership and change, allowed us to build the $70 million for-profit fund where we can both start to scale up companies, including D-Light, as well as be in conversation with governments more effectively to try to prove to them that if Africa wants to solve its electricity issue, and it must, then there's a real response in the off-grid space. But when I step back, and we've so many different kinds of stories in different sectors, but when I step back and realistically look at the 100 companies 15 years later, I can put them into different categories of why they failed, but really there's one overriding reason for success and for failure, and that's character. It's not just corruption that I'm talking about when I talk about character, and we've certainly had a few cases where we just bet on the wrong entrepreneur from that perspective, but it's character in terms of fear, sometimes fear of failure that makes them paralyzed, sometimes it's fear of success. It's the inability to partner, which is so important. It's a lack of self-awareness so that they don't recognize their own weaknesses and hire around it. And so we've gotten a lot smarter at identifying those entrepreneurs who not only have the moral imagination, which I'm going to talk about, but the resiliency, the grit, the toughness, the ability to listen to people who no one's ever asked questions of before. It's a very different kind of entrepreneur that's going to build a solar company for people who make $2 a day. And so I want to give you a few stories of some of the entrepreneurs that personify some of the leadership qualities that we think are so important to solving our tough issues. I mentioned the moral imagination. We say at Acumen that the moral imagination is the humility to see the world as it is and the audacity to imagine it as it could be. But there are 4 stages to getting there that we see, and it starts with empathy. And we hear a lot of people say, what's most important to me is empathy. And it's important as a start, but it's not enough. Because being able to put yourself in another person's shoes and feel how they feel is a step, but it often reinforces the status quo. It doesn't force a change in the status quo. To change the status quo, you have to be willing to immerse. You have to be willing to get involved and understand the actual situation. We don't get to understanding unless we have the immersion. And the understanding is not just the person's own experiences, but the systemic forces that keep people marginalized. You have been visiting all of these extraordinary organizations. You've seen it. I'm sure just being in community changes your whole view, but it's so shocking to me how so many of our policymakers and corporate leaders aren't taking the time to go to those places where the problems actually exist. So the moral imagination, moving from the empathy to true action. You think about the different industries in this broken supply chain. Some of you are working in them that we are dealing with. They're big, particularly right now. Very few are as broken as in the cocoa industry, the chocolate industry. And this woman on your left, Emily Stone, was actually working in environmental consulting where she came across this insight, this fact, that the chocolate industry is a $100 billion industry. The cocoa that's grown, which is mostly West Africa and Latin America, is grown by about 5 million farming families, over 90% of whom make under $2 a day. In West Africa, we've got a lot of situations that are close to slavery. And yet, the big companies are grappling with how do we solve these problems. It's an incredibly complicated, lack of not transparent, all cash-based, therefore corrupt business. So how do you solve it? Well, first, from Acumen's perspective, we look at the social entrepreneurs, those individuals that are going on the margins, if you will, to find new solutions altogether. And so Emily decided, like so many of the entrepreneurs we get to work with, I'm just going to ignore the rules. Because the way cocoa is priced is on the global commodities markets. So a lot of futures trading that don't have much relevance to what's actually happening on the ground. She decided to reverse it, immersion. She went to the farmers in Central America and Latin America, understands their production costs. And then she negotiates a purchasing price from them that's 3 to 4 times what they were getting previously. And then she also has a profit-sharing pool, which she gives to the farmers. And as a result of that plus training, she's producing or buying some of the highest quality cocoa beans in the world today. So her customers now include not only the kind of millennial hipster chocolate companies like Dandelion in San Francisco, but Valrhona and others. She's up to about 140 companies that are now buying from Emily. Like with Delight, that was our first company. We've now invested in other cocoa companies and coffee companies, and so we're seeing a growing group of young entrepreneurs that are breaking all the rules, creating new models, but they're also teaching us a lot about the cocoa industry. That's allowed us then to build a community of incredibly courageous individuals within the cocoa corporations that want to change the whole supply chain themselves. We know how hard it is. We know how complicated it is. We know we need to have conversations that are tender and honest and off the record so that we can work together to see what might be done. But this is what gives me hope about a new kind of conversation that's framed in the problems that we're solving and not whether we're winning by a conventional matter. And we're calling it Cocoa Interrupted, so hopefully it will work. Another big thing that we look for, and particularly because we work in so many cultures where failure is not considered an option, and so people don't talk about mistakes they make until it's too late for us to do anything about it. And so this is something we've really had to get our arms around, is the courage to fail. And the courage to fail quickly, and the courage to talk about their failures and learn from their failures. And one of our best examples of that is actually hails from the Windy City, Chicago, and one of my own heroes, Dave Ellis, who really, I think, shows again what so many of these young entrepreneurs, these young leaders around the world are capable of. So Dave moved from Chicago to Uganda to work in a nonprofit to change the world, much like I did way back when, and got a little disillusioned with the NGO sector in Uganda. So at the ripe old age of 24, moved to Ethiopia, determined that he would start a company, and then as life would have it, the government was essentially giving away its largest chicken farm. The only issue was all the chickens were dead. There wasn't a single live chicken, which didn't bother Dave. He'd never seen a live chicken in his life anyway. And so, as one does, he signed up with his good buddy Joe Shields, and they came to Acumen. We were like, maybe you need to prove something to us before we take a look at this. Somehow raised $100,000. They built a business plan. They found these chickens in India. They got them to Ethiopia. They drove them across the country, and a week later, they were all dead too. And so back to the drawing board. He also understood that the way so many nonprofits want to help farmers is they sell them one-day-old chicks. Well, a one-day-old chick actually needs a lot of love and attention. I don't know if any of you raise chickens, but I don't. But now I've learned a lot about chickens. And so when they would sell the one-day-old chicks to the farmers, they would all die too. And so they had to build a new kind of system where they would incubate until they got the one-day-old chicks. They would sell those one-day-old chicks to agents who lived and died for the chicks. They'd buy them in batches of 1,000. They'd raise them till they were 45 days old. And then they would sell them in batches of 3 to 5 to farmers who make $300 a year. And by that point, the chickens just lay eggs. They can eat whatever they want to eat. It's a great hedge against climate change. And it's a great story because today, Ethio Chicken has sold to more than 20 million farmers across Ethiopia. It's the largest chicken farm in Ethiopia. Last year, they pumped about $250 million new dollars into the economy. They're increasing farmers' income, and importantly, the government has credited Ethio Chicken for reducing child malnutrition in Tigray, which is a region of about 5 million people, by 11%. Another part of moral leadership is having the humility to learn how to partner with partners that aren't easy. And governments are not often easy for private sector, scrappy entrepreneurs to partner with, but Dave and Joe not only learned, particularly Dave learned fluent Amharic and just knows how to get things done and keeps his eye focused on the poor first and foremost. And you should see those chickens. And so what I worry about, though, is sometimes I tell these stories of entrepreneurs, and people go to a place of thinking of the entrepreneur as hero. It's all about the single person that is out there conquering the world. And increasingly, as we look at the world around us and listening to the young people and the poets, the new generation recognizes that that day and age is over. Enough with the conquerors, enough with the knights on the white horses. We need movements. We need to all be heroes. We need to inculcate these same characteristics in ourselves, no matter where we work, no matter who we are. And it was really because of that, and because we realized that capital wasn't enough in our companies, we also needed to help them build talent. Talent was really what kept our companies from growing, not at the top level, at the next level. And so about 10 years ago, we started investing in what we called Acumen Fellows. First at the global level, where we'd identify people that we would send to work in the chicken farms and the rice gasification companies that were delivering biogas to villages in India and Pakistan, et cetera. And then we realized that actually, in addition to talent inside our companies, in the countries in which we were working, if we wanted to think systematically, we needed to build something else, and that was the ability to talk to each other across lines of difference, to partner. And not surprisingly, 3 years ago, we moved from our current footprint, our recent footprint, Pakistan, India, East, West Africa, Latin America, to the United States. And so now we're investing not only in companies, but in leadership. To date, we've supported about 450 young leaders around the world. If we get the video up, we might be able to see them. But these are leaders not only in the private sector, but also in the nonprofit sector. They are extraordinary. And the ones that we identify come from all classes, from the wealthiest, most elite young people of Lahore, Pakistan, who go to Harvard and Oxford, to young people who grew up as scavengers, which are the lowest level of the Dalit, the untouchable community, who literally have to pick up human feces as their vocation, not vocation, as their job. And they're all mixed in this beautiful community of people. And our goal is to build skills to actually help them become true builders, as well as to have the skills and the capacities to talk across lines of difference. We brought them together about 2 years ago, and if I could dream a world, that's what it looked like. And that really gave us the idea for what we want to do now, which is to build this university that Michelle was talking about. But because we get so many applications and because so many young people around the world want to change it, but they don't have community and they don't have skills, we started an online university a few years ago, just essentially putting quickly courses that we teach in our fellows course online. And by now we've had about 750,000 course takers, and we can't keep up with demand. And so that's really what's compelling us to try to take this to the next level. I talked to you about the scavengers. Ankit Agarwal, the guy in the puffy jacket, is such an example not only of our fellows, but of this next generation and the way that they are recreating types of businesses with great moral imagination. Ankit was sitting on the side of the Ganges River when he saw with a friend, and the friend said, "Why are so many flowers that are coated in pesticides floating in the river, polluting it?" And he was like, "I don't know." And so he did a little bit of research, and he saw that in India, 8 million metric tons a year of flowers are taken to the temples to give to the gods. And the priests can't throw them in the trash bins because that would be desecrating the gifts. So they throw them into a sacred river, therefore polluting the river and making everyone sick. And so Ankit built, using the circular economy, a company whereby he's collecting the flowers in the morning. Then he uses women from the scavenger caste that I just described. Women who literally have never been touched in their lives. He picks them up in a bus on a daily basis, feeds them tea and clean water, and now they're making these beautiful incense sticks, eco-styrofoam, and I think he may have just signed a contract, this may be off the record, but with Burberry's for their first patented vegan leather. And so we're just seeing this enormous beauty and imagination and profits. Shamim Akhtar was a reminder to me that this kind of yearning for a new type of leadership exists all over the globe. Shamim was born outside a little village outside Mirpurkhas, which is in the middle of the Big Sindh Desert in Pakistan. Her dad was 12, her mom was 15. They were dismayed that she was a girl, and so his elder brother, who had just finished university, said, "No worries. There'd never been a girl that had ever been educated in their village. Let's just raise her as a boy." And so at age 2 months old, they dressed her as a boy, they treated her as a boy, inside the house and outside of the house. She went to school until she started going through adolescence, and then the father tried to keep her home. She went on a hunger strike. They got her homeschooled. She's about to finish her PhD now, and she became an Acumen Fellow a few years ago. And in our meetings, because we read King and Mandela, and she'd met all these other people from across her country, she decided the work she was doing in this nonprofit wasn't good enough. And so she decided to go back to her region and make sure every girl had an education. And not only are these girls learning the traditional curriculum, but they're studying and they're talking about King and Mandela and their dreams. And last time I was in Karachi, Shamim had just been one of the leaders of a 5-person teacher strike that won the first concessions given to teachers in sin since 1992. And a big piece of it was that they saw Shamim, they thought she was this illiterate village girl. They went up to her, they learned that she was an Acumen Fellow, and then the media got interested because suddenly she was a person of international status. And so that also teaches us that we have to find ways to extend our social capital, give it to people that don't get it enough, and allow them to speak for themselves, and they can do miraculous things. And then Teresa Njoroge, who continues to teach me, was working in Nairobi as a banker when she was put in jail for a crime she didn't commit with her 2-month-old baby for a year. And unlike so many human beings who would understandably come out of it embittered and enraged, she decided that we have a choice to respond to whatever happens to us. And so she's created a nonprofit called Clean Start to fight for criminal justice and give women and men a real chance in prison. And she uses the community of fellows to help find jobs, to train, to really build. And so we're hopefully about to launch this online and in-person virtual university for moral leadership, where we hope to identify 10,000 leaders like this in the next 5 years. Identify them, link them, nurture them, support them. This year we've extended to Colombia and to West Africa. Next year, in person, we'll be in Malaysia, Spain, the UK, and Bangladesh. And importantly, we're experimenting with how to teach online and then allow people in-person meetups wherever they may exist. And it's what gives me the most hope. It's this next generation that refuses to be stuck with what we've got, sees the possibilities, and now needs each other to make change. And that's why the last quality I want to talk about when it comes to moral leadership, what you all stand for as well, is accompaniment. I don't think we talk about it enough. We talk about it as technical assistance or management assistance. But when you've accompanied a company like Delight or Ethio Chicken for 15 years, it goes way beyond management assistance. We are part of each other's celebrations, our joys, also when things really mess up, and they do. And as we build our fellowship, to recognize that the only way we're able to build in ways that sustain, in ways that last, are when we do it together. And most importantly, when we have that strength of diversity that allows us safe spaces to hear from people who could not be more unlike us where we're messing up. So accompaniment. And then finally, given the aspirations that do go across the world, across class, religion, ethnicity, and as Michelle said, has the very humble goal of trying to end poverty altogether, we decided that in this moment of history where we don't have a roadmap, it is so difficult to manage our companies, our nonprofits, to even speak in ways that people can hear, that we needed to have a compass. We need a moral compass. That's the best that we can do. And it's got to be the kind of moral compass that we build together. No single one of us can impose it. And so at Acumen, we spent a couple of years building ours. And I thought I might read it, if you would indulge me, and take it if you want. But it's really held us, and it's become the kind of language that allows us to recognize each other across the world. And it goes like this. It starts by standing with the poor, listening to voices unheard, recognizing potential where others see despair. It demands investing as a means, not an end, daring to go where markets have failed and aid has fallen short. It makes capital work for us, not control us. It thrives on moral imagination, the humility to see the world as it is and the audacity to imagine it as it could be. It's having the ambition to learn at the edge, the wisdom to admit failure, and the courage to start again. It requires patience and kindness, resilience and grit, a hard-edged hope. It's leadership that rejects complacency, breaks through bureaucracy, challenges corruption, doing what's right, not what's easy. It's the radical idea of creating hope in a cynical world, changing the way the world tackles poverty, and building a world on dignity. For us, it all comes back to dignity. The great joy of my life is that I get to meet not only the entrepreneurs and the fellows and the partners, but maybe most importantly, the customers we serve. And they remind me that every day, 1,000 times a day, whether we're brushing our teeth or getting in a car or a subway, we depend on the work, the labor, the toil of other human beings around the world, many of whom we will never meet. And it is to all of us, not some of us, to build a world in which all of us can be seen, all of us can have dignity. And again, it's why I'm so honored to be here with all of you, because this is the work you have signed up to do. Whether you're working in talent, or you're working with students, or you're working to change the companies that you are working in, you have all signed up to build the world we can only imagine, but is up to each and every one of us. One of my favorite quotes from Martin Luther King is that when he says that love without power is anemic and sentimental, and that power without love is reckless and abusive. And if there's ever been a time in our lives for love and power to walk hand in hand, no matter where we sit, it is right now. And so I want to thank you for what you do. I want to thank you for having me. And here's to moral leadership. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Should I get down?
Would you mind doing a few questions,
No,
Jacqueline?
no.
Great. Jacqueline would be happy to do a couple questions if you want up front, and then we're going to do some Q&A at the table. Tiffany.
Thank you. Hi, Jacqueline. That was amazing. I told her that this was going to be a highlight for me at the conference, and it definitely was. So thank you for this. It was really incredible. I just wanted to talk about what you do and the distinction between charity and philanthropy, because I feel like what you do is true philanthropy versus charity. And I don't know how you feel about it, but for me, charity seems like it's a quick response to a crisis, where philanthropy is more focused, long-term, strategic. And I feel like that is what you do, and that's why it's working versus charity. So I don't know if you have any feelings about the two, but in my head, that is the kind of differentiation between the two.
Thanks. I have very strong feelings about the two. As you said, there's clearly a need for charity right now. We look at the tsunami in Indonesia, and the world needs to give. People are dying, and we need rebuilding. And at the same time, too often we think, I'll just give a Band-Aid, and it actually ends up demeaning and degrading people. We don't make change. The philanthropy piece, which is the same money, is just more strategic. It's a more thoughtful way of making things work. And we're still in this, we still get caught in this as acumen, including by the big aid agencies. A classic example will be, we want to give you $20 million to build houses in Pakistan for the poor. And we'll say, but if you understood Pakistani culture, people want to build their own houses. They have for centuries. And if we just build the houses, then what? And then there's no interest, because it's not going to happen quickly. And instead, we still need philanthropy, because we worked with a guy for 14 years doing a mix of grants as well as investment capital, so that we could build, and he could build, a community, not just housing, where people are getting their water and their electricity, and they own their houses over time. The first Sharia-compliant mortgages in the country, and now a more traditional investor has come in with 15 million as the first tranche to take it across the country. Now we have a sustainable model. That's the difference. Michelle talked about all those, that's why I went to housing, all those places, and I continue to see it around the world, where we have foundations of houses and nothing built. Schools even worse. Build a well, build a school. I promise you, if you haven't thought through who are you hiring, how will you sustain that teacher, the schools, the books, the kids, that school will be what they call a ghost school. And right now across South Asia and Africa, 40% of the schools are empty. No teachers, no books, no children. A lot of goodwill of just like, I want to build a school. Wells typically have a 3-year life unless there is some kind of ownership scheme that allows it to be sustained over time. And that's the tragedy of it, because so many good intentions push money toward charity, but I think we have too much of a short-term orientation rather than doing the long, hard slog work that actually makes something sustainable and scalable, and importantly, work for the poor.
Hi, my name is Sabine. I'm very moved by what you shared, because I'm German and I thought a lot about the word dignity in the last couple of years, and how Europe especially is reacting or not reacting to refugees and people in need, and how we're not meeting them eye to eye, but we either look down on them or we look up on them in a weird, twisted way. And so I only have one question for you, actually, which is, you seem to have credible answers to some of the questions. So what can we do to support you to be successful?
Oh my goodness. The hardest question I wasn't expecting, thank you. You know, the easy answer always is we're trying to do a lot of things around the world, including in America, including in Spain and the UK, is financial support. The more interesting answer is, go check out our courses. Take them with young people. They really are quite something. And then tell us, so many of you are working in leadership, in HR, in business schools. What else is needed? We've started to partner we did a course with Fossil, the company, on Social Entrepreneurship 101. This year, you'll be happy to know, we've got a number of refugees that I'm hoping will be selected in our fellows program, but I really want to create some courses online for refugees as well. It gets a little tougher with refugees on fellows because we take them around the region, and refugees are often so confined based on, not as much in East Africa, but in other parts of the world where they can't travel. And so again, by immersing, we're learning so much. So I would say go to our website and learn, take a course, not by yourself, but with a team that is diverse. And if you see opportunities to partner, and if you get moved by acumen, we're always growing. So thank you.
What I'd like to